Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Open to Export webinar about what British businesses trading around the world should be doing to prepare for the impact of Brexit. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I'm the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders. Endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion, we offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session, and you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The general principle here is that we'll only ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such, but if you do have specific questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. Last week, we had to cancel a webinar about what exporters need to be doing to prepare for day one of a no deal Brexit in terms of trade with EU markets. We did, however, record a presentation that was due to take place and answer some of the questions you sent in as well. You can watch this recording on opentoexport.com/webinars or the URL on the slide here, which we will circulate afterwards. But for now, though, it is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Shakespeare from the Institute of Export and International Trade, who'll be updating you on what businesses trading beyond the EU need to be doing to prepare for Brexit. Over to you, Kevin.
Hello, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be presenting today. So as indicated, I will be covering some of the Brexit considerations, both in terms of impacts and opportunities for trading with the rest of the world and outside of the European Union. So today we will obviously cover trading goods and some of the impacts, but we'll also cover trading services as well. And during the course of this slides, I will also refer to some key aspects that impact businesses of all types with respect to areas such as data protection, GDPR, and employment of EU nationals. So I just want to make sure that we cover all the aspects there that apply for both businesses trading in goods and trading in services. So one thing I want to say that applies to all types of customers is in the current Brexit environment, but in the general business environment, all businesses should be communicating with their customers and their suppliers and stakeholders. Never is this more important. There is a tendency sometimes for companies in the rest of the world, certainly in the current Brexit environment, to take their steer or their guide from the UK company. Their view is obviously they're hearing a lot about what is happening from Brexit in the United Kingdom. So UK companies, supplier of goods and suppliers of services are in a position to advise them what they should be doing. And it's also important to communicate, because if you're not communicating with your customers, suppliers in the rest of the world and in Europe, then it could be that your competitors are as well, and trying to take competitive advantage from the perceived position. So it's important. Communication is absolutely fundamental. In terms of some topics that you can communicate, clearly if there's new tariffs applicable to goods, and those are import tariffs, for example, which would be payable by the overseas buyer, then there needs to be communication and impacts considered. Any impacts in terms of transit of goods for EU countries need to be considered. How tariffs can possibly be eliminated and mitigated, but ultimately what opportunities can arise by negotiating and discussing with your customers. And I would stress this is equally important, not just for Europe, but customers in the rest of the world. They may be thinking, well, what does Brexit mean for me? It's not just about the UK and Europe and the European Union, it's about the rest of the world as well. I just also want to refer to some further events that are taking place as with regard to Brexit planning. So the Institute is arranging 4 events, and you can see on screen there from the 23rd of October in Cambridge, 24th of October in Plymouth, 28th of October Newcastle, and the 30th of October London. And what we're trying to do is something different at these events. We're trying to make sure that specific Brexit action plans are produced so that every company goes away who attends the event goes away with an action plan in terms of what they need to do in the context of Brexit. We will be talking about some of these actions today, but we want to make sure that this is specific to every business attending. So the needs of every business who attends these events. And also we're trying to create a little bit of a focus on micro businesses and rural businesses as well, and businesses trading in services, because we're very conscious that a lot of the visibility on Brexit and the information is very focused on trading in goods. So for companies trading in services, there's less visibility of the issues, but the issues still exist. Opportunities exist as well. And equally, the micro businesses, it's not always easy when there's a lot to do to actually determine what the Brexit impacts are and where you sit within, if you like, the Brexit supply chain. So there's focuses there in sort of making sure we have coverage, but businesses of all types are very much welcome to attend. The events are free, and as I said, we're looking to make it specific to each organisation. So it won't just be a lecture on Brexit, it will be specific action plans. There's information on the Institute website, but if you need any specific details for any of these locations, we can also advise. So free to attend, and you can register when you go online. Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to look at the concept of operating under WTO rules, both for trade in goods and for trade in services. So first of all, trade in goods. So the WTO is made up of 164 member countries. And clearly, as has been indicated previously, if the UK leaves the European Union under a no deal Brexit, it will revert to WTO rules. So it can act independently. It can act to set its own third country tariffs. Now, this is important, and there could be an opportunity or benefits from business from the UK's announcement of its 12-month temporary import tariff. We're going to be looking at that shortly. It can negotiate its own free trade agreements. So if the UK leaves the European Union on the 31st of October, deal or no deal, it will be free to negotiate its own trade agreements. And clearly there has been some commentary on the types of countries that trade agreements may be negotiated with. But again, that's subject to what happens in the next few days and weeks. So that's the concept there, and it operates under the concept of most favoured nation status terms, which basically means that the UK, like any country, cannot discriminate against country B and offer them different, less preferential terms than country A. And a lot of what the WTO does is not just about tariffs. As we're going to look about, the WTO has a number of rules and regulations which will apply to the United Kingdom. So opportunities and impacts are rising. So again, what we try to say is that clearly businesses must prepare for Brexit. That's probably fundamental. So communicate with your customers and suppliers in the rest of the world as well as in Europe, and also communicate with your customers, suppliers in the United Kingdom. They may be selling a service or exporting a goods from what you're providing. So again, you're part of a supply chain there that you need to consider. So the general principles we've talked about, UK is a founding member of the World Trade Organization, but the membership covers a number of agreements which we'll look at. There's the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS. There's the Information Technology Agreement. There's procurement agreements as well in terms of bidding for government contracts worldwide. And there is the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, as well. So these rules and these agreements are fundamental to how world trade operates. Ultimately, world trade operates at a global level through the WTO, and then the European Union at a regional level. So the global level, the rules of international trade are set at the global level by the WTO. So the WTO General Agreement on Trade in Services GATT. So I just want to talk about this. So generally, this provides a general framework for encouraging cross-border trade in services. And it requires all 164 WTO member states to liberalize their trade in services where possible. So it's generally done through what the WTO refer to as four modes. Mode 1, the ability to supply services cross-border. Mode 2, the freedom to consume services in another country. Mode 3, the establishment and the opportunity to establish commercial legal entities in the country you are providing the service in. And mode 4, the ability of individuals to travel to other countries to supply services. Now that might be fairly obvious, but the WTO General Agreement on Trade in Services is groundbreaking in that it recognizes the need to liberalize services. You will see on the slide that it refers to scope for members to make exceptions and exemptions, if in the national or strategic interest. I guess what does that mean? We'll be looking at that in the context of the European Union for trade in services, but it allows each country to actually, you could argue, put barriers up to trade in services, but there has to be a reason they put barriers up. So, for example, if content of some form is seen to be harmful to people within the environment, that is against the national or strategic interest. But you can't just put barriers up for the sake of it. So that's an important concept there. And there has been some disputes at WTO where some countries, not in Europe, but in other parts of the world, have put barriers up to, say, media content, audiovisual content there. But that has gone to WTO for dispute. Now, as I've indicated, the UK still benefits from the Information Technology Agreement. So the actual Information Technology Agreement was established about 20 years ago by the WTO, and it covers worldwide access to high-tech goods. So, for example, computers, mobile phones, and semiconductors. And what it was trying to do is to, again, liberalize and encourage the growth of high-tech information technology goods. So a lot of goods that support high-tech technology such as games consoles, TVs, GPS receivers, effectively tariffs have been withdrawn on those goods. So that has allowed obviously the growth of mobile phones, of televisions, of technology as a whole. So if you are part of a supply chain to information technology, either as a consultant or a provider to the main organizations providing services, obviously the mobile phone companies, gaming, for example. The Information Technology Agreement is a key piece of WTO that you should be aware of, and it does provide opportunities for members of the WTO. Now, let's now look at trade agreements in the event of a no deal Brexit. And I would like to stress that trade agreements are not just about trading goods. Some of the legacy trade agreements that were negotiated between countries tended to cover goods and covered trade in services less. But some of the more recent, and I say more recent probably in the last 15, 20 years, have covered trade in services. So they would cover points like intellectual property protection, the ability to use government procurement services in the overseas country, the ability to provide consultancy software. So a lot of the trade in agreements are being updated. So the European Union, for example, is updating trade agreements with Mexico, with Morocco currently, to very much cover, to have it as a more comprehensive trade agreement that covers trade in services as well as trade in goods. Now, the EU currently has 70 plus trade agreements, and you can see the link there to the Europa EU website for details about the status for every country. And the general principle is that if the UK leaves the European Union with no deal, that the UK will lose access to these trade agreements. And we'll look on the next slide some examples of countries that could be impacted positively or negatively, as the case may be. But these trade agreements, as I say, cover sale of services, public procurement, as well as trading goods. Now, the UK is trying to roll over these trade agreements. So we look at the next slide. We'll see there a snip from the government website where you can see information in terms of the status of these trade agreements with countries outside the European Union. So the UK has currently negotiated or rolled over 16 trade agreements More recently, Tunisia and Lebanon have been rolled over. And there's some big countries there, clearly, the likes of Norway, Switzerland, South Korea, for example, Chile. So there's some quite big countries there. But it's fair to say that not all the EU trade agreements have currently been rolled over. So you have the web link there, which tells you the status of discussions. And if you look at that web link, you will see that negotiations are ongoing with the likes of Canada, of Mexico. When it's North Africa, Tunisia has been rolled over, but discussions ongoing with Morocco and Algeria, for example. It also says where the trade agreement is unlikely to be rolled over, continued, and before the 31st of October. And probably the two countries that come out in particular there are Japan and Turkey. So if you are providing goods and services, for example, to Japan and Turkey, then do consider obviously potential impacts there. The basic principle is the same as with the European Union, that if the UK leaves a no deal, goods entering Japan and Turkey, to use them as the two examples, will be subject to import tariffs and possibly different requirements in terms of packaging and labeling of goods as well. So we're going to look shortly at creating an export spreadsheet, a sales spreadsheet for trade with the rest of the world. But do consider it in the context of what your sales profile is currently and whether the trade deal has been rolled over. And you can actually click on the links here from the website to see what has been rolled over in the case of each trade agreement. So, having talked about the fact that tariffs can apply for trading goods, how can you actually establish what the tariff is? So one of the ways of doing this is on the slide here is to go to the WTO website. You go on the WTO website, click on it, and you'll see the screenshots here in terms of you can filter it by country. Obviously for the European Union, any country in the EU will just come up as the European Union, but you can cover it for all members of the WTO, whether it's Japan, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, United Arab Emirates, for example. And then you filter it by product. So if you know what your product commodity code is, you would click it in there, you would click the find button, you would then click next, and you will have the opportunity to download a spreadsheet. And you can download it for the different countries that you export to create a sales spreadsheet. So that can be important in the context of determining tariffs. So just a point on tariffs, and we may refer to it in a later slide. In terms of tariffs, the higher level tariffs are generally for agricultural goods. So if it's products of animal origin especially, which can include the likes of milk, eggs, cheese, butter, obviously live animals, the tariffs will be a lot higher, possibly 50% plus. Seafood, sea fish, and bakery products, for example, might be around 8, 9, 12%. So the average globally for each country globally in terms of its tariffs is around about 22% for agricultural goods. Now, a lot of medical products globally tend to be zero. Not always. They're zero a lot in the European Union on the basis that medical products save people's lives. So it's a great encouragement to get medical products to help in terms of benefits to the local population. But some countries will have tariffs on medicine from 2 to 5%. In some cases, it's zero. Manufacturing products, engineering can vary, can be somewhere like 5, 10, 12%, similar for textiles. And countries tend to tariff on the basis of goods that are part of component supply chains, raw materials and ingredients would tend to be lower than finished goods. So if you want to bring a finished car in or a finished piece of clothing in, tariffs tend to be a lot higher because they don't create any employment and any production in the country itself. But those are the general principles. But the most important thing for your business is to check the tariff applicable to your country. So having done that, you can create the export impact spreadsheet, and you can do it for the imports as well, but we'll talk more about imports shortly. You'll see at the top of the spreadsheet on the screen, you've got Europe covered, but we've also want to cover the rest of the world. And I've just given you some examples on the screen of the rest of the world. There might be clearly other countries. So what you would do using this spreadsheet as an example is key in your level of annual sales, what the percentage of total sales is, and also do the UK in this. So it creates focus in terms of where your sales profile is. what the current WTO import tariff is, based on the previous slide we looked at, and then whether there is a trade agreement with the European Union. You have the web link there in terms of establishing whether there is a trade agreement. If there is a trade agreement, you work on the basis that there is zero tariff. So let's look at South Korea as the example there. So trade with the European Union, goods generally enter South Korea free of any tariffs because there is a trade agreement, irrespective of what the WTO tariff is for South Korea. But then you need to check, if the UK leaves with no deal, what is the impact on UK exporters? And then you need to check whether a UK continuity agreement has been signed through the web link that I've referred to and is also on this slide again. If it has, South Korea as the example, goods will continue free of tariffs. But let's use Japan as another example. The Japan one, the indication is it will not be rolled over, signed before the end of October. So therefore, there is a potential impact in terms of tariffs for your exports to Japan. It might be 2, 3, 4%. It could be more, depending on the nature of the goods you are supplying. So the tariff currently applicable post-Brexit. What that does is it starts to focus your mind on potential tariffs that can apply and starts to inform discussions. Now, we appreciate some companies on the call have possibly gone through this process and have actually started entering into negotiations. So as I've said, examples of tariff rates you can see there. And on the slide, I've talked about agricultural goods, textiles, medical products as well. But do look at the tariffs, because if you have certain types of products, cosmetics, they will be subject to individual tariffs depending on the nature of the actual product itself, energy projects, oil and gas, for example. And clearly, in terms of visibility, there's been talk that the UK may negotiate trade deals with the United States, India, and Australia, for example. That is obviously conjecture based on what happens over the next few weeks. Okay, I'd now like to look at 12-month temporary import tariffs. Now, I referred to it earlier. In the event of a no deal Brexit, the government has announced that there will be a 12-month temporary import tariff. And the basic principle of this is that tariffs are removed on 88% of imported goods into the United Kingdom. So, for example, tariffs are removed on raw materials that are part of production processes, manufacturing, clothing, automotive, car parts, for example. Tariffs still apply, however, for food and drink products, and tariffs still apply for finished goods, so finished cars, clothing, for example. Now, it could be as an importer, if you're receiving clothing from what's called Generalized System of Preferences, GSP countries, like, for example, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, that you will still be able to use the GSP scheme in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But if, for example, you are bringing in finished cars from Europe or finished cars from Japan, United States, they will be subject to tariffs. If, however, you are bringing in automotive parts as part of supply chains, textiles as part of supply chain, and clothing, generally tariffs will not apply. So what you need to do is establish for your product whether there are what or if there is a temporary import tariff. This could be quite significant. So speaking to a lot of companies, there has been a potential benefit here in terms of a no-deal Brexit. So if, for example, you are importing from China or the United States or India, for example, if your product is not on there, you are not subject to tariffs. This is not just a temporary import tariff for the European Union. This is a temporary import tariff from every 164 WTO members. So that could have a significant impact there if you are importing steel, for example, from the Middle East, if you are importing manufacturing engineering parts from the United States. So do look at that and see what the impact. Also, clearly, currently trade with the European Union has zero tariffs. And for these products that are not on here, they will be zero tariffs from the European Union as well. So do have a look at that in terms of the impact. Okay, let's talk about supply chain now. Let's talk about this from a sort of rest of the world side. We will talk about services as well shortly. So meeting rules of origin. One of the biggest factors facing companies is potentially on proving origins. So the basic principle here is currently if you are exporting outside the European Union, you have to produce a European Community Certificate of Origin. And that puts roughly that the origin nationality of the goods has to be around 60% EU origin. Doesn't matter whether it's in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, in Lithuania, in Poland, in Germany, 60% around EU origin. Now, in the event of a no deal Brexit, the theory and principle is that there will be a new UK certificate of origin, which indicates that the threshold will be 60% UK nationality origin. There may be some movement in terms of percentages, but that's the theory of 60% at a global level for demonstrating origin. So why is demonstrating origin important? Well, one is that clearly some countries like to buy British on the basis of quality, of reliability, and they want a UK certificate of origin to demonstrate that the goods are British. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is preferential origin. So we'll use South Korea. Well, we'll use South Korea as an example first of all. The theory is that you need to demonstrate origin 60% for the preference, in other words, zero duties to apply. So certificate of origin is important. Now, what the UK has been trying to do when it's been rolling over and continuing trade agreements is to include EU origin for the first few years in there. So South Korea is considered to be the template. Is that under the negotiated deal with South Korea, EU content will be included in the origin for the first 3 years of that agreement. So that's important, but I would stress it varies by country. So do look at the level of origin in your goods. Is the goods based on EU origin? Are the goods based on UK origin? If you cannot establish 60% UK origin, what does that mean? Would it have an impact? If you're exporting to South Korea, it wouldn't do. But if you're exporting to Japan, for example, which has said it will currently will not accept EU origin in terms of preferential trade, what impact does it have? So it is by a country basis to some extent there. So where do you export? Where is the profile? Absolutely becomes key. The other thing you need to consider is if you're selling to Europe and it's UK origin and the customer in the European Union, your customer is onward selling it. So for example, you're selling to France and it's onward sold to Morocco or Algeria. If you're selling to Spain and it's onward sold to the Latin American countries, they need to produce an EU certificate of origin. If they can't do that, that could impact them in terms of preferential origin. So look where you're selling, even in the European Union, and are you clear where those goods are ending up? I've given you some examples there. So that's an action that businesses need to consider as well. So as we said, meeting rules of origin, review supply chain. Where are your goods coming up? Are there opportunities for you to become part of new UK supply chains? So if your customers are having to look at UK to meet the UK rules of origin, does that potentially give you an opportunity to actually sell to UK companies? Now, at this stage, I'd like to refer to customs special procedures, not just in the context of the European Union. One thing that Brexit is arising is the need for companies to look at their customs processes. Now, if you're trading outside the European Union currently with the rest of the world, you will make customs declarations. You'll be familiar with the process of customs declarations and the need to maintain proof of export files, to have the goods departed message, and the importance of that. Clearly, as has been called out previously, if the UK leaves the European Union, those processes will have to apply for trade with the EU on both the export side and the import side as well. But do consider, both for your trade with the EU but outside, are there elements of customs special procedures that you can put in place? So whether that's warehousing, so tariffs are only paid when they move out of the warehouse into free circulation. Repairs, do you have repairs in your business? Both obviously in the event of a no deal Brexit with Europe, but obviously with the rest of the world. Can you use customs freight simplified procedures? where you have simplified declarations, especially if you've never made a declaration before. Can you use the benefits of the the Common Transit Convention around authorised consignee, authorised consignor? Now, what I would say for businesses, this is not something you can take lightly. Customs, HMRC need to approve companies for using these processes, just like authorised economic operator. And if you're going to go through a process of a warehouse or using transit, you do need to see, do I need to look at what other customs special procedures? Because customs special procedures help. They can reduce tariffs and sometimes alleviate tariffs. They can improve cash flow. But they do require consideration of their benefits, and they do require a customs visit. So the company is opening themselves up for review of their customs procedures. So it's not something to be taken lightly, and the company has to be ready for it. But in terms of how we trade in a no deal Brexit, we will potentially see more use of these systems where companies are using more customs procedures. Okay, now let's move on to services. I just want to mention in terms of trade of services as a whole, if you are providing, for example, a consultancy or software service to Europe, the basic principle, if the UK leaves the European Union, it will be outside of the single market. So in theory, that allows the countries in the European Union to put barriers up, because a company selling services in the UK will be the same as a company selling services in India, for example. We will be a third country outside the European Union. However, those barriers have to be legitimate barriers. We've looked at the WTO General Agreement on Trade in Services. It can't be an arbitrary barrier which is seen as blocking trade. There has to be a valid reason for actually not providing the services. And the actual requirements of selling a service in the European Union vary by each European country. So if you're looking to sell, for example, to Austria, to Spain, to Belgium, there will be different requirements. So we can provide you with a link. There is a gov.uk website which talks about selling services and actually selling different types of services in various countries. So again, we can provide the link. It is on gov.uk, which you can filter the type of service you are providing, and you can filter it by the European country as well. So I just wanted to mention that. And I would say this is the concept of being a third country. If a company is based inside the European Union, which the UK is currently, there are no barriers. They are part of a single market. So on GDPR and data flows. So the potential issue here is that currently the UK is part of the European Union. The potential issue could arise if the UK leaves the European Union. Any data that's held on personal customers, consumers, which is employees as well, not just customers, may be unlawfully held by UK companies, because the UK is not part of the European Union. Now, the UK is looking to establish adequacy status with the EU, which means mutual recognition of GDPR standards, which in theory should take place because we were all in GDPR together when it came in. However, it may take time, we don't know how long, to negotiate the adequacy status. So what should companies do now? We'll look at that in the next slide. The main action is to go to the Government Information Commissionaire's Office, the ICO. We'll look at that shortly. I just wanted to mention, while we're on the subject of GDPR, not a Brexit issue, but something companies you may already be aware of, is there is due to be a new e-privacy directive, which was due to come in at the same time as GDPR, but it is more technical and it's taking longer to negotiate. So things like cookies will be covered under the e-privacy directive that may make it illegal to hold information and do marketing on the basis of website visits. So if your company is heavily reliant on that, there's a web link there. Online privacy is the next big thing that's coming. So do look at that if you're any company, but if you're looking at consumers and how you're using that, the e-privacy directive will be, if you like, the enforcer of GDPR. So I talked about standard contractual clauses. The Information Commissionaire's Office web link is there. What businesses need to do if they are going to rely on standard contractual clauses to hold personal data on employees, on customers, is they should take the guidance from the Information Commissionaire's Office. It has specific guidance on what a standard contractual clause looks like. If you're not following that guidance, technically you could be perceived to be in breach. Now, it is fair to say well, how would the authorities know you're in breach? And this is very much a people issue. If a person says you are holding my personal data, a dissatisfied customer, a tourist or something like that, then clearly that is an issue. So if you are going to rely on standard contractual clauses, look at the ICO guidance. You have to follow that guidance. Otherwise, you are not meeting the EU regulations on standard contractual clauses. Okay, let's look at staffing and human resources as well. Now, again, this applies for all types of businesses, not just trade in services, but there's some sectors, for example, software, technology, where a strong reliance, tourism, a strong reliance on EU national employees in the business itself. So the basic principle is whatever type of company you are, you should support your EU nationals. So on the 30th of March, the government introduced an EU settlement scheme. It was in pilot before then, which allowed EU nationals to apply for settled or pre-settled status. We'll look at what that is shortly. Since the scheme has launched, 1.5 million applicants have been granted status to settled or pre-settled status, 61% settled, 39% pre-settled status. And I've got the example of Scotland, but it applies for England. There is support for EU nationals from a Citizens Advice Bureau. So if any EU nationals need help with technology, need help with the application process, the Citizens Advice will provide support. But the basic principle is you want your EU nationals to continue working. They're a valuable resource for your business. Encourage them to apply to the settlement scheme. So what is settled status? If you've lived in the UK for 5 years continuous, and that needs to be 6 months of any 1 year, you are known as continuous 5-year residents. You can apply for settled status. That allows you to use the NHS to live and work in the UK, take account of public benefits such as pensions and study in the United Kingdom. So I guess a very, very important element. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at pre-settled status. So if you've not met that 5-year rule, you can apply for pre-settled status. And again, it gives you the same benefits as settled status. And basically, EU nationals have until the 31st of December 2020 to apply for settled or pre-settled status in the event of a no deal. If we move to the next slide, we're going to look at something else in terms of the application process. So again, an issue that has been flagged up is the main way of applying is by an Android phone. There's been issues with the iPhone functionality and making the application. That obviously a lot of work is going in that respect, and it's due to be remedied, or we advise, later this year. You can apply by post, and in some big cities, you've got the web link there. There are document scanning centres you can go to where someone will help you actually scan in. And you've got the Citizens Advice Bureau as well, which is there to support people maybe who have difficulty with technology and the forms as well. What you will need is proof of identity, so a valid passport or national identity card and a national insurance number. There will obviously be a criminality check as well. So the application process is really important. So I'd also refer to in a slide in terms of the Euro temporary leave to remain. The government has announced that in the event of a no deal Brexit, a new Euro temporary leave to remain scheme will come into force. And that basically says that in the event of a no deal Brexit, the EU nationals will be able to come and work in the United Kingdom and apply for Euro temporary leave to remain. They can apply when they land to work in the United Kingdom. And if it's granted 36, and they're allowed to work in the UK 36 months from the date of granting. And they can apply for settled or pre-settled status before the 31st of December 2020. So again, in terms of recruitment, not just software, not just technology, if you are reliant on EU nationals and in recruitment, the Euro temporary leave to remain scheme, along with the EU settlement scheme, allows you to attract valuable employment into your businesses. The final slide we're going to look at is an example of a weekly planner. So you can see there an example of a weekly planner where I've mixed in things from our services and a goods side in terms of things you have to do, customs declarations, speak to your freight forwarder, licensing, the CE mark, and various things like that, review Incoterms. But you should do that in a global sense as well. It's not just about the European Union. Intellectual property protection, trademarks, standard contractual clauses for GDPR. It's good as a business to work on action plans, which is coming back to my earlier points. The 4 events that we're hosting, we want to create specific action plans specific to your businesses. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin, for the presentation and lots of advice there. I hope everyone's found that useful. We're now going to answer some of your questions. Please remember that you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The first question I'm going to ask is from Janice, who asks, how will orders made before Brexit with VAT paid be shipped into the EU without our customers incurring VAT too?
So it obviously depends on whether it's VAT on goods or VAT on services, but let's cover both. So currently, if you are exporting goods to the European Union, dispatching goods as opposed to exporting, VAT is claimed back through the reverse charge mechanism. So the importer or the buyer in the European Union claims it back through their VAT return. In the event of a no deal Brexit, the way that UK companies sell will be the same as the rest of the world. You will zero rate your VAT. And this is a very important point, because if you zero rate your VAT, just like with goods to the rest of the world, you must have a proof of export file, which includes a goods departed message, the commercial invoice, the transport document such as a bill of lading, the quotation. Otherwise, if customs audit you and you don't have that file, you will be subject to payment of VAT and obviously a fine as well. Now, also it has implications for the overseas buyer, because they will have to pay import VAT upon landing of those goods in the European Union. And they will have to find a way of having to defer or try and defer for a duty deferment guarantee. So again, another reason to discuss with your customer, because the impact of having to pay VAT immediately will impact possibly their cash flow. They can claim it back through the reverse charge mechanism, but they've got that cash flow impact. Now, if it's services, currently trade-in services with the European Union and generally globally operates on the place of supply rule. So if you are providing services, let's say for example for a VAT registered company in Spain, it's based on a place of supply. The place of supply is Spain. So VAT is paid for by the Spanish customer and they can claim it back. If, however, you are providing services to a company or a consumer that is not VAT registered, you have to account for the VAT yourself. It reverts back to the place of provision of the actual service. Those rules do not change in the event of a no deal Brexit. That's a more global rule on place of supply.
Great, thank you, Kevin. A question from Nikki is in relation to tariffs. Nikki's asked, is the starting point for the commodity code list the current EU tariff? For example, will the commodity codes that my goods are classified under today remain the same on day one, or will there be some reclassification required to code under a new UK tariff?
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously the starting point for determining tariffs is the commodity code, which indicates the importance of it. And I would stress the commodity code is important because it also indicates whether an export license is required, whether it's a REACH chemicals type product as well. But will commodity codes change? Some of the advices are indicating that in the initial period, they will not. Obviously, further announcements could come out at any time, but the initial advice is that the commodity code structure will remain the same. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Is commodity codes derive from harmonized systems codes, HS codes, which are determined at a world level, not an EU level, not a UK level, but a world level. So any changes at a world level, which do clearly take place, will impact the EU and the UK in the normal course of business. But just to stress, the initial advices are commodity codes are not changing in the near future. However, we do need to await advices. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. A question from Heiko, I hope I said that right. They've asked, how about customs registration and certification like VAT registration of an EU company and also the UK EOI numbers and VAT registration in the EU located countries? And last but not least, a certification. What impact will there be on those sorts of registrations and certifications?
Okay, so let's take the question in parts here. So obviously, it depends on the need for a European VAT number. So if you are selling services, if you're, for example, using the mini one-stop shop for VATs, a MOS system, you will need a VAT number. If you are making a customs declaration in the European Union, and this is obviously coming back to previous webinars around use of Incoterms and making customs declarations, you will clearly need a UK EORI number, which should have been automatically allocated now, which will be based on your UK VAT number. If you are making the customs declaration in the EU and in anywhere in the world, you will need to have in the case of the EU, an EU EORI number. And that would be an EU EORI number which you would obtain from a customs authority in Europe. So you just need to obtain an EU EORI number from one customs authority. But you will also have to obtain a VAT number as well, because the VAT numbers in Europe are made up in a similar way configured as they are into the UK. You do not necessarily currently need a legal entity in the EU to obtain an EU EORI number, but you do need to obtain a VAT number. Some countries in the EU have indicated that they do want legal entities, but if you go to certain countries that they don't require a legal entity. Similarly, if you're selling on ex-works terms, Incoterms, and your overseas buyer is responsible for collecting the goods, then they will need a UK EORI number. They don't necessarily need a UK legal entity, but they will require a UK VAT number. And this comes down to the fact, obviously, the importance of communicating and speaking with customers and suppliers, which I appreciate a lot of you have already done. So that shows the importance there in terms of VAT, tariffs, and customs declarations. And probably it's one for trading in goods, it's one of the more important Brexit issues. If you've got to make a customs declaration in Europe, you've got to get an EU EORI number. Time is running out in the event of no deal Brexit. And likewise, if your European buyer has to get a UK EORI number, they've got to do it quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I've got a couple more questions around EOI numbers and also another one on a TSP number. John's asked, do you have to know your customer's EOI number? And that's linked to a question from Emma, who's asked if we are importing the goods, but these get delivered straight to our customers, which EOI number is used? And then after that, we had a question from Ellie, who's asked, she's got her EOI number, but not her TSP number yet. How long does she have to wait for it? So I guess a couple of questions on EOI numbers and TSP.
Yeah, so first of all, do you need to know your customer's EORI number? It's probably good practice to know it because you may need to refer to it. But the basic principle is how the EORI number is used. So if your customer is making the customs declaration in the United Kingdom, they can make the declaration themselves, or they can use an agent or a freight forwarder, which probably would happen more. So the actual EORI number doesn't necessarily need to be made visible to yourself, because you are not making the customs declaration if you're selling on ex-works terms, for example. So EORI number is very much a number which is specific to the company making the customs declaration. It clearly will be provided to, for example, the freight forwarder if they are making the declaration, and clearly it will be visible to customs as well. The second question then, I'll just start around Transitional Simplified Procedures, TSP. An announcement was made very recently that companies will now be automatically enrolled for Transitional Simplified Procedures. That was a very recent announcement. So the application process, the registration process in theory is no longer required. Now, just to confirm there, it is you are enrolled for TSP. You are recognized as TSP. It's not necessarily a number. You are recognized, and you are recognized against your EORI number. So effectively, if you are recognized for transitional simplified procedures, you will be able to benefit from transitional simplified procedures in terms of duty deferment, if there are any import tariffs, and remember I said that 88% of those tariffs have been removed. You will also have less inspections, or let's rephrase that, inspections only in the event of border force-led intelligence, and you will also be able to, very importantly, make simplified customs declarations. Normally, to make simplified customs declarations, you require to have customs audit you and you go through a process. So customs is more or less saying that in the event of a no deal, you will get that relief. So the government has announced you will be automatically registered, just as you will be automatically registered for postponed VAT accounting, so you don't have to pay import VAT as well. However, I will strongly suggest to every company you make sure you receive notification that you are registered for TSP and for postponed VAT accounting. The government is picking everything up from the VAT numbers. So your VAT number, every VAT registered business will be automatically enrolled as per the government announcement. But do make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Kevin. Just another quick follow-up on that. Gokhan's asked, can you use TSP for air freights as well?
Yes.
Excellent. A question from Gordana, and she's asked, in the context of a EU-Korean free trade agreement or a continuity one, a UK business already has approved exporter status and is currently using the corresponding approval number on the invoice origin statements. What happens after the 31st of October?
Yeah. So first of all, when we talked earlier, the trade agreement with Korea Republic, South Korea, has been continued, and it is held up as a template of what the UK would like to do. So EU content, to the best of my knowledge, will be allowed for 3 years. So that helps preferential trade with South Korea. With regard to approved exporter status versus a certificate of origin, announcements will be made in the event of a no deal Brexit on the new UK certificate of origin. Now, clearly approved exporter status can be applied currently to Korea, to Japan, where countries where the EU has trade agreements and preferential origin, and it is a very, very good thing to do. Equally, it is a customs procedure as well, so application is needed to customs, and you have to demonstrate end use and end user on the goods. As to what happens in the event of a no deal Brexit, advices will be awaited from the government. So there will be a requirement for a new UK certificate of origin, and you would hope customs would apply the principle of approved exporter status, not just to South Korea, but wherever the UK has continued trade agreements, so Israel, Tunisia, Lebanon, for example, Switzerland, etc., albeit Switzerland's under a different transit arrangement. So again, it's a case of watch this space, but generally special customs procedures and origin, which approved exporter is, should continue. However, we are awaiting formal advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think on a similar theme from Leszek, I hope again I said that correctly. Regarding the transport of goods in transit in day one, is any easement planned for those being in transit in the UK territory before day one on its way to the EU? Do they need or not need to do an export declaration on day one or just after it has been loaded onto a vessel or train to the EU?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, which is partly why some companies are obviously speaking to their customers and suppliers, and they're making sure that the shipment arrives before the 31st of October. So there's no issues with goods on the water. So it raises a very interesting question. So clearly, if goods are moved between the UK and the European Union in the event of a no deal Brexit before the 31st of October, customs declarations will not be required, and some of the other elements around export health certificates, catch certificates, etc., will not need apply. But what happens, as you correctly say, if the goods are actually on the water and they arrive in the European Union after the UK leaves? It's a really good question. I think the best thing to do there is speak to your freight forwarder, your haulier who is carrying the goods. They probably need to give some advice. They certainly need to give some advice in terms of slots and transport times. There are obviously emergency supplies for things like medical, and various tenders have been announced for the carrying of medical products. However, you do need to speak to your freight forwarder if goods are on the vessel. The theory I would stress is that European customs could say they need an inbound declaration and they need certain documentation. But I would strongly suggest speaking to your freight forwarder to make sure A, you can get the slots in place, but B, can they provide some assurance about what's required? Now, they might say they can't. Some freight forwarders will try and assist, which is why some companies are trying to move goods and actually get the goods to land, so to speak, by sea, air, road, rail before the 31st of October.
Great, thank you, Kevin. We'll do one last question from Ellie. Ellie's asked, do we still need to complete intrastat details?
So again, in the event of the UK leaving the European Union, the rules around VAT will change. So I need to check the precise requirements there that are needed, but there will be government advices coming in terms of what is required. The likelihood is you will need to complete something similar, but not necessarily the same.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Well, I think on that note, I think we'll wrap up. So thank you once again for the presentation and the answers there, Kevin, and thank you everyone for your questions as well. Thank you. In terms of what the Institute of Export and International Trade are up to at the moment, we are running several Brexit-related training courses, including the ones Kevin mentioned earlier, and many of these courses are fundable by government grants as well. I'm sure you won't need reminding of the enormity of what is ahead, but you really do need to ensure you've got the core export skills covered, including completing customs declarations. So please do look at the funding available for our training courses. Some of you will also know that the new Incoterms 2020 rules have been released by the International Chamber of Commerce, and we are running a series of training courses licensed by the ICC this autumn to help you stay up to date with them. And finally, we also have our London World Trade Summit coming up next week on October 23rd. This is a great chance to hear from global trade experts and to network with fellow exporters as well. You can find details about all of our training courses, our events, membership offerings, and education programme at export.org.uk. In terms of Open to Export, we're doing 2 webinars next week. We'll be running our final Brexit webinar for the moment anyway, next Thursday, and this one will cover what you need to be doing to mitigate risks around the volatility of pound sterling. And the second one will be on Friday, which will cover what you need to know about the new Incoterms 2020 rules as well. You can find details about all of our webinars at opentoexport.com/webinars. And finally, we're currently running an Export Action Plan competition with BB Financial Services this autumn. This is a great opportunity for SMEs to win £3,000 towards their export plans. The deadline to enter is November the 5th, ahead of a showcase final in Birmingham on November 28th. And we really do recommend you have a look at this because it's a great competition and a great opportunity for SMEs. So the details can be found on the opentoexport.com website. But that's all for today. Thank you once again for attending, and we hope you found that useful. And please do take our exit survey to let us know of any concerns or questions you may have. So yeah, thank you everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye.